I think the first place to start before we get into who is Sidney Gottlieb, and how did he run the CIA search for mind control, is to acknowledge the fact that there were people maybe doing this sort of thing before Gottlieb, and especially you point out in the book that there were some World War II efforts in Nazi Germany and as well as in Japan with Unit 731. So I'm wondering if you can, enlighten people to, what those efforts were all about, and I think it'll make sense to people how, Gottlieb kind of got inspired and probably worried about, what the Soviets might do or the Chinese might do, um, based on some influence from those groups and their efforts.
So MK Ultra definitely did not just be created out of nothing. There had a foundation, it had a basis, it had a history. Part of this went back to World War II. So we're all familiar with stories about medical experiments that happened in Nazi concentration camps. Experiments is kind of a gentle word. It's essentially a form of medical torture, oftentimes fatal. And these experiments were designed to test pain thresholds and figure out how long it would take for people to die from certain different causes. So they were tremendously gruesome. They were just forms of murder in which investigators also tried to learn something from the way they murdered people. It turns out that also, although it was less publicized in the United States, the Japanese were doing something very similar during World War II. In fact, some of the experiments carried out by this Japanese Unit 731 were probably even more grotesque and awful and revolting than anything that the Nazis did. In fact, while I was writing my book, Poisoner in Chief, I have about one long paragraph, I guess about one page, that describes the tortures that happened in this Japanese unit. And while I was proofreading my book, I read every chapter over about 100 times before I send it in. I decided I'm not going to read this paragraph over because it's just too awful. I'm going to read it once, it's fine. And then the other 99 times when I go through this chapter, I'm just going to skip over this paragraph. So that's how intense the experiments, as they were called, on human subjects were during World War II. And when Sidney Gottlieb later on was named to begin this very ambitious CIA project, um, he did what a normal scientist would do is setting off on any new project, and that is to find out what research already exists. What do people already know about how to destroy a human mind and a human soul and a human body? Uh, we don't have that information in the United States because we haven't carried out those kinds of experiments. But the Nazis and their Japanese counterparts knew all about this. So Gottlieb took advantage of them. And he not only used the history of those units to shape MK Ultra, but he actually hired the Nazis and Japanese torturers to come in and explain how certain poisons worked and what would be most effective means of destroying a human spirit. So the experience of World War II, particularly the experience of the torturers in the Nazi and Imperial Japanese Army, was definitely part of the early foundation for what later became MK Ultra.
Yeah, so I think, people might be hip to the concept of leveraging Nazi knowledge in the United States post World War II, more from oh, that's kind of how we started NASA with Werner von Braun and all the rocket scientists coming over via Operation Paperclip. But what you're saying is that Gottlieb maybe extended the paperclip effort and pulled in the scientists who were doing these sort of horrific human experiments to build up his baseline knowledge for the task that he was really going to be asked to complete when he gets to the CIA.
After the Second World War, it didn't take long for the United States to decide that our scruples about the Nazis aside, we wanted to take advantage of some of the talent that the Nazis had assembled. So the first group of ex-Nazis or Nazis that we hired in the United States were exactly the ones you mentioned, the rocket scientists. And they became very important in the American space program. So after that, it became a project of the CIA to begin recruiting Nazi spies. Don't forget that after the Second World War, we started spying and carrying out espionage and other operations covertly inside the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But we didn't know anything about those countries. We had never established an intelligence network inside the Soviet Union because they were our allies. We weren't spying on them. So when it came to the post-war period, when we wanted to spy on the Russians, the only people who knew who all the anti-Soviet, anti-Russian government people were the Nazis. So that was the second group that was brought in, the second group of Nazis. First was the rocket scientists, then came the spies. And Sidney Gottlieb had the idea, well, we should also bring in the chemists. This actually began even before Gottlieb arrived at the CIA. The idea was uh, the Nazis were interested in the idea of mind control. So let's find out what they know and what tactics and techniques they developed when they were torturing all these people to death. And we can put some of that knowledge to use. For example, how much sarin does it take to kill a baby compared to how much sarin it takes to kill an adult? Well, nobody in the United States knew this. But we were able to bring over a couple of Nazi scientists who actually gave a presentation at the CIA. They had killed people with sarin, people of every age, and they were able to give us all this information. So multiply that times multiply that many times, and you get an idea of how important the knowledge that we gained from Japanese and German torturers was in shaping MK Ultra.
Get the chills just thinking about it, but I think it's going to be really mind blowing for a lot of people to hear about this. So I guess in the book you talk about a Camp King that's in Europe, and I think that does that coincide with the era, like the timing of starting to bring the Nazi scientists over, or is that like does that predate the Nazis coming over? We leveraged them in Camp King and started to learn from them and then brought them over? Or how did that shape out? And if you could just maybe elaborate on what the theme behind Camp King was, that would be great.
While I was writing the book, Poisoner in Chief, I actually went to Germany because a lot of the experiments were carried out there. And I went to what was Camp King. It actually lasted for several decades after the end of the Second World War. And it was a center for interrogation. And some of this interrogation was the brutal kind. You had this gang of soldiers who liked to call themselves the Rough Boys. And they would have baseball bats and clubs, and they would make prisoners run through the gauntlet and beat them. You'd hear screams sometimes echoing through the camp. There were also higher level so-called prisoners there, like Reinhard Gehlen, the chief Nazi spy for Eastern Europe, who was coming to work for the United States. He had a nice villa at Camp King. Uh, and I think maybe it was the experience of those interrogators at Camp King that led in a way to the idea of chemically trying to achieve a truth serum or some other way to make people talk. Instead of beating people with baseball bats, could there be another way that might even be more effective of getting people to talk? So one of the original bases of MK Ultra was the idea of a truth serum. That's really where it started. What can we give people to make them tell the truth? And I think the experience of Camp King led some people to believe that's the primitive way. That's the old-fashioned way. Now we're getting into a new era of better living through chemistry. So there might be another option. And that, I think, fed into the genesis of MK Ultra.
Well, and that's a great segue into maybe the introduction of Sidley Gottlieb, who really is the focus of your book, Poisoner in Chief. Um, could you give us a little insight into, you know, who decided to bring this, who found this guy, Sidney Gottlieb, and who decided to bring him into the CIA, and what kind of was his mandate once he gets there?
Sidney Gottlieb was probably the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. He had what amounted to a license to kill issued by the US government. He could drop into Germany or the Philippines or Japan or South Korea and requisition from the local CIA station or military police human beings, prisoners. And then he could take them and experiment them to death if he wanted to. So uh, I can tell you a little story about my book. After the book was finished and the publishers were working on the cover, I finally got a note from the CIA. I had been begging them for over a year to release a photograph of Gottlieb because Sidney Gottlieb lived in total anonymity. My book, Poisoner in Chief, is essentially the biography of a person who did not exist. He was invisible. So, uh, when the project began, Gottlieb was a chemist. He had a PhD in chemistry, and he had not been able to serve in World War II because he had a club foot. He limped, and that made him feel kind of guilty that he still wanted to serve his country somehow. Um, he was a talented chemist, and because he had worked in a couple of other government agencies, came to the attention of the CIA. Now, it's very interesting to compare Gottlieb's background to that of the other CIA officers of that early period in the 1950s. So the CIA at the top level was populated almost entirely by silver spoon aristocrats, rich kids who had gone to the same prep schools and the same Ivy League colleges. They belonged to the same country clubs and yacht clubs, and they dated the same girls, and they worked for the same investment banks and law firms in Washington. It was a closed elite, a real WASP aristocracy. Sidney Gottlieb was completely opposite. He did not fit into that group at all. He was Jewish. His parents were emigres from Central Europe. Uh, he limped. He had a stutter. He went to City College of New York. He was completely different from everybody else at the top level of the CIA. And upon reflection, I came to conclude that this probably was not an accident. The people at the top of the CIA, particularly Alan Dulles, who was then the director, realized that the person they brought in to run this project would probably have to do some awful things. There would be a lot of what in the intelligence world is called wet work, which means assassination, murder, torture, things that are really bloody and awful. I think that those people at the CIA did not want one of their own fraternity brothers to be that person. Not only was the work so repugnant, but it's easily conceivable, even at that early stage, that this could all backfire somehow. Maybe it could become public, or maybe somebody would have to be blamed for it. Somebody would have to be thrown under the bus. And they didn't want that to be one of their own. So they picked this guy, Sidney Gottlieb, who was so different from any federal bureaucrat of the 1950s. Instead of living in a little ticky-tacky development, for example, he lived way out in the Virginia woods. He built himself a cabin. He was like a proto-hippie. He even tried to use solar energy back in the 50s. He didn't have electricity, didn't have running water, grew his own vegetables. He got up before dawn to feed his goats. So he was a real kind of, in that sense, a person who was really ahead of his time in kind of his spiritual orientation. And as you pointed out at the beginning, it's quite bizarre to compare these two sides of Sidney Gottlieb. So at home, he was writing poetry and studying Zen Buddhism and family man who was an active member of his community. And then at work, he was overseeing the most intense and gruesome experiments that have ever been conducted by any officer of the United States government. And he didn't seem to hesitate at torturing people to death. He was the most prolific torturer of his generation. So how do you explain this? Well, I have a lot of speculation about that towards the end of my book. And I sometimes wondered, maybe when he was driving in from Virginia and he would cross the bridge over the Potomac, he would kind of shed his nice guy, family man, Buddhist orientation, like the way that a snake sheds his skin. Then he would go into the office, carry out all these projects, and then as he would go back home, maybe he would resume that other identity. So Gottlieb was an extraordinary figure and went on to carry out a project that maybe very few other people would have been able to do.
Yeah, I mean, it brings the whole concept of being a different person at work and at home to a whole new level, right? Like this guy literally oversaw the worst, but then he's at home learning all the dances of the world with his wife, talking philosophy. He has, I think you mentioned in the book, verse from the Quran on the ceiling or on the wall in his house, like kind of a student of all cultures and raising a family too, right? Like he it wasn't just like him and his wife. He raised a bunch of kids in this homestead lifestyle as well.
Yeah, he had four kids, and I later, when I was researching Poisoner in Chief, located a woman who, in her teenage years, had been the girlfriend of one of Gottlieb's sons. And she told me some interesting stories, which I put in the book, although she asked not to be named. Um, and one of the things she said was that she was in the house and her boyfriend, Gottlieb's son, said, my father kills people and he works for the CIA. And then he took her into his study, told her to turn around, not look. And then when she turned back around, there was a case full of guns in the house. Um, and later on, she speculated that maybe he was afraid that some of the victims or the friends or relatives of the victims of his experiments might come after him sometime. That never happened, but it shows you how aware Gottlieb was of the fact that he must have created a lot of anger and outrage along with a lot of pain.
Yeah, I mean, based on what you documented throughout the book, I don't know how he couldn't be aware. Now, uh, you framed it in the book that Gottlieb had this fear of, well, one, he wanted to make up for not participating in World War II, like fighting infantrymen kind of thing because of his disability. But there was also this real fear of communism at the time, and the real fear that like, oh, the Soviets are going to figure out mind control or communist Chinese, and he sort of leaned into that, and maybe that was his justification why he could do these really terrible things because he had to beat the Reds to it. He had to, make sure that we were on top. Um, I mean, I can't think of any other reason why a guy could sleep at night and justify these things, but maybe it was really just embedded in a sense of patriotism or trying to prove himself.
I think there are some interesting explanations for this. The main one is what you mentioned, the Cold War climate. It's very hard for us today to put ourselves back in the early 1950s. This was a time when Americans were led to believe that a Soviet nuclear attack on the United States could come at any moment, that the Soviets were bent on conquering the entire world. And this would not only mean the enslavement of the United States and the West, but because of the brutal nature of the Soviet idea, it would essentially mean the end of any possibility for meaningful human life on Earth. If you believe that, if you believe the stakes are that high, then the deaths of a few people or a few hundred people would seem like a very small price to pay. So I definitely think that that motivated not only Gottlieb, but it motivated the people who hired him and came up with this idea of having a CIA mind control project. I don't think that's the full explanation, though. What led the CIA leaders to believe that there is such a thing as mind control and that they could somehow master it? I think there are a couple of explanations. One might be cultural conditioning. Think of all the books, all the movies, all the TV shows in which you've seen hypnotism or mind control. Somebody puts a pill in somebody's drink and then the guy becomes a zombie, or you sway a watch in front of somebody's eyes and then they're fully under your control. There are movies where the diplomat is hypnotized into going into his embassy and stealing documents and giving them to the good guys. I think there was a sense that if novelists and screenwriters could come up with these ideas, then scientists could be able to make them real. So there was this kind of blurring of fantasy and reality. Then, shaped by this conditioning, Americans in the security apparatus in Washington in the early Cold War were terrified by two episodes, both of which we now know they completely misinterpreted. But they believed that these episodes proved that communists and communist powers were already working on the mind control project and had made tremendous strides. So what were those two episodes? First was the trial of the Roman Catholic prelate in Hungary, Cardinal Mindszenty. This guy had been arrested by the Hungarian communist government and after some months was put on trial. At his trial, he confessed to crimes that he obviously had not committed, and it was clear that he had been coerced. It later turned out that he had been coerced by the same means that prisoners have been coerced over centuries, like extended interrogations and sleep deprivation and so forth. But the CIA didn't focus on that. What they were more interested in is the way that he spoke. It was in a kind of a monotone. And this led Americans in Washington to believe he's not talking himself. Somebody is implanting these words and these ideas into his head, and his mouth and lips are moving, but it's somebody else talking through him. That was not true, but that was the terrible fear that they saw when they watched these tapes of Mindszenty testifying. Then, after the Korean War, came another episode that was equally terrifying. It turned out that some of the Americans who had been captured by communist forces during the Korean War had written out confessions, and some of them had confessed to committing war crimes, including using biological warfare, which the United States had always insisted never happened. A number of them denounced racism and other ills in American society. And this was considered shocking in America, that our strapping young boys would do anything other than uphold the American ethos and the American flag. So the idea developed that somehow these guys' minds had been altered. And a number of them were sent home, repatriated on a long train trip from North Korea across China and Russia to Europe. The train passed through the Chinese province of Manchuria. And there became this idea that maybe it was during that train trip that these guys were given strange drugs or some other treatment. And that's where we get the phrase Manchurian candidate. So the CIA says, first of all, this cardinal in Hungary obviously seems to have had his mind captured by someone else by a technique that we know nothing about. And then there's another permutation of this technique turning up in another communist country. So this led them to think, we got to panic now. We realized that if you could find the secret of mind control, make other people do whatever you wanted them to do, the prize would be nothing less than global mastery. So it was essential that the United States catch up with this crash program that the communists were launching, which of course did not exist. So this also fueled the enthusiasm and the intensity behind MK Ultra, and served as the excuse or the rationale for the destruction of so many lives by Sidney Gottlieb and the torturers who worked for him.
Wild. So, you know, like you said, they have this impression that they're falling behind in this mind control effort, and it really is, the keys to the castle in terms of world control. Um, you mentioned earlier that uh, they thought this could be achieved by chemical means. We went from the rough boys and the old school forms of torture to maybe there's a chemical key to unlock this all. Now, initially, it sounds like I think you mentioned in the book there's a scientist, L. Wilson Green, who thought this new substance created by Albert Hofmann and Sandoz Laboratories, LSD, could be a battlefield weapon where, over the battlefield, you drop like an aerosol spray of LSD and everybody kind of just loses their mind while fighting. But Gottlieb seems to have recentered the conversation and said, no, 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 this is a tool for targeting the individual, not a big collective group. And the program, I guess, from reading the book, that Gottlieb inherited was Bluebird, but it became Artichoke under him. And then in '53, Dulles gave him the green light to roll it out into MK Ultra, which became 160, I think, or 140 plus sub programs. But wondering if you can, maybe talk about how Gottlieb gets fixated on LSD being this potential key chemical to change the game in the mind control world, and I guess talk about how we go from Artichoke to Bluebird, and um, there's this it's kind of grotesque thing you mentioned in the book, this 8-ball tank that Gottlieb had. It sounds like that was his initial, like, I'm going to run these tests experimental grounds or something like that. So that was a long-winded ramble, but yeah, maybe if you can at least get us started in understanding why Gottlieb was so fixated on LSD and its potential.
Gottlieb began by looking at all possible ways of wiping out a human mind. Again, like a scientist, he concluded that before you could find a way to implant a new mind into someone's brain, you first had to find a way to destroy the mind that was in there. You had to create a blank slate. So a number of his tortures were aimed at destroying a mind and creating an absolute void into which later on, hopefully, some new mind could be projected. Uh, so, how do you do that? How do you destroy a human mind? With help from the Japanese and Nazi torturers, he came up with some ideas. A number of these did include drugs. For example, we know about one experiment that he carried out early in MK Ultra in Germany, where he would lock the victim into a kind of a coffin-sized closet, then put the person uh, into a deep coma with sedatives, then feed the person overdoses of amphetamines to make the person hyperactive. And then, while the person was in the transition phase from coma to hyperactivity, uh, administer intense electroshock to see if all that together would work out. Uh, he used all sorts of different varieties of chemicals, and I think he probably knew more about chemical poisons than anybody in the world. He had people out finding the inner organs of alligators in Africa and Latin America. He was extracting poison from Alaskan butter clams. He experimented with anything that his mind could imagine about ways to destroy human awareness and consciousness. Then the news came about LSD. And LSD immediately fascinated Sidney Gottlieb. He and his people thought that it might be, as one of his assistants put it, the key that could unlock the universe. In other words, the answer to the question, how do you control people's minds? So Sidney Gottlieb became really the first LSD maven. He realized that this substance was so powerful in such small doses. It was colorless, it was odorless, it seemed like a perfect tool. In 1953, Sidney Gottlieb persuaded the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD. And that's what it did. It bought it from the Sandoz chemical company in Switzerland, which was actually happy to get rid of it. It didn't want this distraction. So suddenly there's this massive supply of LSD, and it's owned by the CIA. So Gottlieb, in his experiments, devised two categories how he would try out and test LSD. Part of it, the beginning, was a set of coercive experiments, very similar to the ones that he had used with other drugs. Gottlieb had good relationships with prison doctors and prison wardens because, of course, those people have control over human beings who can be supplied for experiments. So, for example, we have a document about an experiment that happened at the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky. Gottlieb had the prison doctor there segregate 7 African-American inmates into a cell and then feed them what was described as triple and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days. The purpose of that experiment was to find out whether that kind of overdose could destroy a person's mind. We don't know. The protocols have all been destroyed. But my guess is yes, that would certainly go a long way to destroying people's minds. And later on, I began to wonder about those 7 guys. Did they get out? Were they sane ever? Did they have the slightest idea of what had happened to them? Nobody knows because Gottlieb was careful to burn all the records as he left the CIA. So that was one kind of experiment with LSD, in which it was used and administered in overdoses to unsuspecting victims, including one of the victims we now know, one of the very few who later wrote about it, was the Boston gangster Whitey Bulger. He was in the prison in Atlanta for a truck hijacking, and he was told that they needed his cooperation in an experiment to test a drug that might cure schizophrenia. And he writes that he was going mad. He was going crazy in his cell, seeing the clocks on the wall dancing and all kinds of things like that. But he was afraid to tell people what he was seeing because he thought then he would never get out at all. And he never recovered. He said he could, his whole life long, he could never sleep with the light off, for example. And he had spasms of anger. So that was one kind of LSD experiment. But Gottlieb was also interested in how ordinary people would respond to LSD in a clinical settings, being fully informed of what was happening. So he wanted to recruit volunteers to be tested. And how he did this was to appeal to other hospitals and clinics because the CIA doesn't have its own hospitals and clinics. He set up a couple of bogus medical foundations. And on the letterhead of those foundations, he sent out letters to hospitals and clinics across the United States telling them, our foundation is interested in experimenting with a new psychoactive drug called LSD. And if you're interested, we will supply the LSD, we will pay you, and what you have to do is put an ad in the newspaper, call for volunteers to try this drug under medical supervision, explain exactly what it is, and then send us back reports on how these people react. So almost overnight, a new market grew up of places that wanted to cash in on this new bonanza. And the experiments began. So who were among the very first people to come in and sign up to try this psychoactive drug? One of the very first was Allen Ginsberg, the radical poet who actually listened to Wagner on the headphones while taking LSD, and as we know, later went on to become a great high priest of the LSD cult. Another guy was Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He loved LSD and then brought it home and turned on all his friends. And that was a way that LSD leaked out of the laboratory. Another one was the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Ken Kesey. So Ken Kesey volunteered also, and he got this wonderful drug. He loved it. And then he got a job in a mental hospital. Later on, while researching Poisoner in Chief, I found an interview with Ken Kesey in which he said, yes, working in that mental hospital is what gave me the raw material for my book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But that's not why I got it. I took the job. I took the job for a different reason. I wanted to have the key to the pharmacy so I could steal the LSD and bring it home to my Kool-Aid acid tests. So it was through these experiments that LSD crept out of laboratories and into the counterculture. The irony, of course, being that the drug that the CIA hoped would give it the power to rule the world actually wound up fueling a generational rebellion that was aimed at destroying everything the CIA stands for. So that was the contradiction of Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA man, becoming the godfather of LSD in America. And in fact, while I was researching Poisoner in Chief, I even came across an interview with John Lennon. He was asked about LSD, and his first reply was, "We must always remember to thank the CIA." Now, John Lennon had never heard of Sidney Gottlieb. Nobody had. But if he had, he would have said, "We must always remember to thank Sidney Gottlieb."
I mean, that is the ultimate irony, is it? And the Summer of Love and Grateful Dead, the wave of that scene still ripples out through to this day. So yeah, it is beyond ironic and quite comical, and probably the best thing that came out of all these horrible medical experiments, and often done without people's knowing. And I'm wondering if maybe we can pivot to a pretty infamous instance of dosing people without their knowing, and sort of the repercussions of that. I think it ultimately does kind of lead to Sidney Gottlieb's downfall, as you mentioned in the book. But it wasn't just criminals or unwanted persons, or things of that nature that were tested on. It sounds like Sidney not only took LSD over 100 times himself, but he was actually dosing his colleagues at the CIA as well while this was going on. And I think there was one colleague in particular, Frank Olson, who was dosed, and there was a pretty terrible snowball effect, if you will, from that experience. I'm wondering if you can enlighten us a little bit about Frank Olson in particular.
I actually found a memo from the CIA Director of Security to the CIA employees warning them to stay away from the punch bowl at the Christmas party. That was because Gottlieb was known already around the CIA as a guy who was experimenting with LSD or other drugs, and you just didn't want to go too close to him unless you knew exactly what was in what you were drinking. Um, so he was interested in testing it licitly and illicitly on various people. In fact, I have the nice story in the book where he's on a plane and he gets up to get a glass of water, and he's going back to his seat, and he hears a person sitting on the aisle whisper up to him, "Is that LSD you're drinking?" And he's horrified because nobody's supposed to know what he does. And he looks down, it's Alan Dulles. So that's one person, his boss, who would know what he was doing. So the case of Frank Olson really is a signal turning point in Gottlieb's life, although it took many years before its full explanation was clear. So Frank Olson was one of that very small group of chemists who worked with Gottlieb. He was an integral part of MK Ultra. His specialty was aerosols. how do you transform a liquid substance like LSD into a spray? And these sprays were used in various ways, and uh, Frank Olson used kinds of sprays to experiment on monkeys, for example, and he'd go into work in the morning and all the monkeys would be dead, and that would be considered a successful experiment. After a while, this began to wear on him. He actually wasn't the right man for that job. He became disturbed at what was happening at MK Ultra and what he was being asked to do. Uh, at one point, he was on an MK Ultra mission in Europe, and while he was in England, he witnessed and apparently participated in an experiment on a young British soldier in which the guy was administered drugs and died. This was a kind of a breaking point for Frank Olson. He even told the British doctor that he was through with this. He didn't want to do any of this anymore. And that doctor immediately then informed Gottlieb and the people back in Washington that you've got a guy here who doesn't seem to be quite with the program. Uh, this led to concerns about Olson. Uh, so, in fact, Olson did actually tell his wife that he wanted not only to quit MK Ultra, he wanted to quit the CIA. Um, we have a conversation with one of his friends from those days, and the friend says that Olson asked me, "Have you ever watched anybody die?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I have." And then Olson even asked him, "Do you know a good journalist?" Now, if the story of MK Ultra had been made public in the 1950s, it would not only have devastated the CIA, perhaps ruined it, but it would have devastated the image of the United States in the world. So the possibility of a leak from within that very tight MK Ultra group was naturally very disturbing to Gottlieb and to his superiors. Uh, Sometime before Thanksgiving in 1953, Gottlieb was invited to a retreat where the other MK Ultra officers were present. Several of them, including Olson, were given LSD without their knowledge. Maybe it was an effort to see what he was really thinking, that they could get him to talk and find out how dangerous he really was. Nobody really knows what the exact purpose of that was. Finally, he agreed to be checked into a psychiatric hospital and was brought to New York for that check-in. He was in a hotel room across from Penn Station with rooming with another CIA officer who was the deputy director of MK Ultra. And in the middle of the night, he went out the window, landed on the street, and died. So this was reported in the press as the suicide of an army chemist. Well, in the first place, he was not an army chemist. He was working for the CIA. Then all it became clear was that there had been a suicide, and because the guy had been very depressed and uncertain. That was the story. Then, 20 years later, in the mid-70s, exploded all these stories about CIA abuses. And in one of the reports, there was a mention of a CIA officer who had been given LSD and had gone out the window of a hotel in New York City. So the family of Olson immediately recognized that there can't have been very many people that went out windows of hotels in New York City while working for the CIA. So that must be Dad. And sure enough, they investigated, and it turned out that that's when it was discovered that he had been given LSD without his knowledge shortly before he went out the window. So actually, the Olson family was invited into the White House. They met with the President of the United States, Gerald Ford, who apologized. It's the only time in history, I think, that a president has ever apologized for an attack against a CIA officer by the CIA. The family also asked to go and see William Colby, who was then the head of the CIA, and they did. And Colby said something very interesting to them, talking about Gottlieb. He said, There was a lack of supervision. Some of our people were out of control in those days. That was correct. He was right. That's exactly the scenario for which the CIA had been preparing 20 years earlier. Their idea was, let's not control Gottlieb. Nobody ask him what he's doing. And that way, if it ever comes out, we can say we didn't know anything, and it'll be true. People will be able to say, oh, goodness, there was a lack of supervision. So let's not give him any supervision so that later on in 20 years, somebody will be able to say that. So that was the way the story, that was version 2. It wasn't just that he was depressed and committed suicide. It was that he was depressed and made psychotic by having been given LSD. And that's why he committed suicide. Then flash forward another 20 years plus, more evidence begins to emerge that maybe Olson did not go out the window of his own accord. Maybe he had help going out the window. And then the family had his body exhumed. They not only had found a assassination manual written at the CIA, probably by Gottlieb, which said that the best way to kill people was to throw them out of a high window and smack them on the head very heavily first. They opened the coffin of Frank Olson, and sure enough, there was a large bruise on his forehead. So then the third version was he didn't commit suicide because he was depressed. He didn't commit suicide because he had been made psychotic by given LSD without his knowledge. He didn't commit suicide at all. He was killed by the CIA because of the danger that he posed. Now, this is all in the realm of speculation, so there's no smoking gun. But the evidence, although it's all circumstantial, is very strong. It's intimidating. It's persuasive. And when you put yourself in the place of Gottlieb or of Allen Dulles, and you realize the stakes, you can understand how this might have happened. So that's an example of the extremes that MK Ultra drove the CIA to embrace.
Well, and this all sort of came to light like 20 years later after it happened, like you said, right around the time of Watergate, right? So like this was the CIA was put under the microscope probably for the first time ever. I mean, this is like the church committees were going on, and this kind of led to the creation of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, as well as the Senate equivalent, right?
Yes, so back in the 1950s, Senator Mike Mansfield and a group of other senators had tried to establish a committee to oversee the CIA. But President Eisenhower was dead set against it. He said it would be passed over my dead body. And he made sure that senators voted on his side to get, even persuaded some of the sponsors of the bill to take their names off. So it wasn't until 20 years later that this committee was established. Had it been established in the 50s, it might have found out something about Gottlieb. Gottlieb had gone through a career change within the CIA over those 20 years. By the end of the 1950s, it had become clear that MK Ultra was not working, that there wasn't going to be a magic mind control drug. People in the CIA were becoming dubious about what Gottlieb was doing. And in true Zen Buddhist fashion, rather than fight back and demand that his little fiefdom be maintained, he agreed. And he said, not only should MK Ultra be altered or modified, we should just abandon it. Let's abolish it altogether. And he even admitted that there is no such thing as mind control, that's what it had led him to conclude. LSD, for example, he concluded, as we would all guess, it's too unpredictable. It's not a truth serum. It makes some people tell the truth. It makes other people lie. It makes some people go to sleep. It makes some people wake up. You can't predict what it's going to do. So Gottlieb finally wound down MK Ultra in the period around 1960. And then he went on to one of the top jobs at the CIA, which was the head of the Technical Services Division. That's the organization that makes all the gizmos and the toys and the tools that spies and covert operatives used, those little micro darts and poison pills and poison everything. So Gottlieb brought his poisoner skills with him to be the head designer of CIA implements. If you've ever seen those James Bond movies, there's a guy named Q.
Yeah.
He's in charge of all the gizmos. That was Sidney Gottlieb. That was exactly his job for the CIA. Um, so that was one of the top jobs at the agency, and he performed it with outstanding ability. He created all kinds of amazing devices for CIA officers to use. Then comes the mid 1970s, and suddenly, as you point out, there's this explosion of revelations about what went on at the CIA. At this point, the director of the CIA was Richard Helms. Now, Helms had for years been the unofficial boss of Gottlieb. Gottlieb didn't have a boss unless it was the head of the CIA. But his rabbi sort of at the CIA was Helms. So Helms was one of the few people who knew a lot about what Gottlieb had done. In 1974, President Nixon, immersed in the Watergate scandal, asked Richard Helms, as CIA director, to claim that the break-in at Watergate was part of a CIA operation and therefore could not be discussed because it had to do with national security. Helms didn't want to do that. That was too big a lie. So Nixon fired him. He made him ambassador to Iran. And as Helms was leaving the CIA, he and Gottlieb had a fateful conversation. They realized that there were a lot of traces of what MK Ultra had been and what Gottlieb had done. And this could be devastating, even at the remove of many years. So they decided that all the records of MK Ultra should be destroyed. Now, the destruction of federal property is a felony, but it's not nearly as serious as torturing dozens of people to death. So that was a risk I think they were both willing to take. So they agreed that they should cleanse this, that as one of them put it, let this die with us. So Gottlieb telephoned the CIA Record Center out in Laurel, Maryland, and told the person in charge that there were 7 crates of MK Ultra documents, and he wanted them all destroyed. So these probably would have been descriptions of the different sub-projects and probably protocols of the experiments. So we'd find out everything that was done. The director of that depository was very reluctant. He didn't want to do that because he knew it was a crime. He didn't want to do that. So Gottlieb actually drove out there and confronted the guy with the authority of rank and ordered him to destroy those documents. And the guy in his logbook wrote that he had destroyed the 7 crates of MK Ultra documents were destroyed, quote, over my stated protest. So that's why we know so little about MK Ultra. I think my book, Poisoner in Chief, tells more about it than any other book that's been written, but I'm painfully aware that Poisoner in Chief only reveals a small portion of what MK Ultra was and what Gottlieb did. It's the tip of the iceberg. It's terrifying to think of that, but it's still a signal and very important episode in American history. It has reverberations beyond the drug world. Gottlieb composed a manual which essentially set out techniques of coercion. How do you make a prisoner break down and tell his secrets? How do you destroy a prisoner's sense of self? This was the perfect area for Gottlieb to write about because that was his specialty. That's a handbook that he produced later went on to become the basis for the Phoenix program in Vietnam. And later it was translated into Spanish, and a version of it was sent to secret police and torturers in places like El Salvador, Paraguay, Brazil, Chile. So Gottlieb's techniques, somewhat refined over the years, went on to be used right up to the period of Abu Ghraib and Afghanistan prisons. It's a legacy that we still live with. And Gottlieb, as I said at the beginning, turns out in the end to have been this hugely powerful figure nobody even knew existed.
I mean, it's amazing that this is the story of one man, and certainly he had help, right? But like you said, one man and no one knew he existed. You can't help but wonder if there are other Gottlieb-like figures throughout history, and you can't help but wonder what really, like you said, the full scale of his efforts was. I mean, it's yeah,
Well,
the
I can tell
crime.
you, I can tell you just to conclude a story we talked about at the beginning. As I was working on the production of this book, I finally got a photograph of Gottlieb from the CIA. And I called my publisher or I sent him an email jubilantly saying, guess what? We have a picture. We know what he looks like, so we can put this on the cover of the book. And he also wrote back immediately, wow, this is great. Congratulations. Then later the same day, he wrote me back and said, wait, I changed my mind. We've had a meeting in here about this. And we realized the picture is not a good picture for the cover because nobody will recognize it. Nobody knows who this guy was. So the cover just shows a black silhouette, which was really all that he was as far as everybody in the world knew. Now, you ask, could there be people out there now who are doing things comparable to what Gottlieb did in incomparable secrecy? Um, it's hard for me to believe that there aren't. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a Stephen Kinzer in 20 or 50 years from now who'll be writing about things happening in the 2020s that we have no idea about right now. So Gottlieb, as I said, finally reached the logical scientific conclusion there's no such thing as mind control. But although he was right, he was only right at the time that he said it. Now, since then, that was more than half a century ago, there have been incredible advances in AI, neuroscience, cyber technology. So maybe what was true then, there's no such thing as mind control, might not be true now or in the future. If there is no person in a secret room in China or Russia or the United States trying to experiment with mind control using modern techniques, I'll be very surprised. It would just make sense that that kind of research is going on. You'd like to think that it's going on a little bit less brutally than it was in the 1950s, but the idea of mind control still has a fascination, and it's a fascination that science may slowly be turning into reality.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more about that last snippet, and I think it's a fitting way to sort of round out the conversation and leave people with something to ponder. We are at the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of your time. So, one, I want to say thank you. This is incredible, a real honor to connect with you, and I know that the people that are going to watch this are going to be very excited to go read your book if they haven't already, and probably go more explore this topic on their own beyond that. But before I let you go, one thing I like to ask everybody I meet with is there anything that's top of mind for you right now? It doesn't even have to be related to the book or the subject that you'd like to share with people that you think's relevant and you want people to know about.
I'll tell you this one little story that happened to me while I was writing the book. So Gottlieb, as I mentioned, had four children. So they were all now older adults. And it was natural as a biographer that I want to go out and talk to them. So I focused on one who was the older surviving son. He had quite a career. He wrote a book about labor history. I think he became the state archivist of Wisconsin. So I wrote him an email. I didn't hear back. I started trying to find him on Facebook and Twitter. I sent him certified letters. I sent him FedEx letters, different addresses. And finally, I decided he's not replying. So I got to go out and doorstop him, as we call it in journalism. Just go out and sit on his doorstep until he comes out in Madison, Wisconsin. Um, but before I did that, before I got around to doing that, I found a person who was very close to the family. And this person told me, that son will not speak to you. And I'll tell you why. After Gottlieb died, his widow brought the four kids together and made them promise that they would never, ever speak about their father. So the three surviving Gottlieb children, as I said, now older adults, are carrying around a lot of information, a lot of memories, a lot of insights, a whole lifetime full of reflection on their father and what he did. And boy, would I love to tap into that.
Well, I hope maybe there's a future Stephen Kinzer out there that's up to the task and could help enlighten us all. I think, as you probably know, looking back into the past helps us protect ourselves collectively in the future. So that's a great final thought, Stephen. What a treat again to read your book and to spend this time with you. Thank you for jumping on, and I hope everybody else enjoyed this as much as I did.
Enjoy might not be the right word, but thanks for having me.